All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get things started. Again, I want to introduce myself. My name is Rachel Stevenson, and I'm the Events and Social Manager here at Identity Automation, and I'm going to be your moderator today. To begin, I want to let everyone know that all attendees' lines have been muted to make this webinar the best experience for all of us. And with that being said, should you have any questions throughout the presentation, go ahead and submit them using the comment and question submission box in the control panel on your screen, and we'll be sure to get everything answered by the end of our time today. Our presenters today are Principal Solution Consultant Greg Pearson and Identity Automation's founder and Identity Fellow Troy Moreland. Today's webinar, Advancing Your Identity Management Strategy with the IAM Maturity Model, is the first of a 7-part series, and we're going to be kicking things off with Federation. I'm now going to pass the controls and mic over to Greg to talk more on he and Troy's tenures at IA and the maturity model itself.
Thank you, Rachel. Welcome, everyone. My name is Greg Pearson, and I will be one of the presenters today. I have been with Identity Automation for 10 years, focusing on identity and access management. I spent the balance of my career in various roles in technology, including leadership, strategy, and consulting. Joining me today is Troy Moreland, our founder and Identity Fellow here at Identity Automation. Troy is an industry expert in the area of identity and access management, having deployed various solutions in hundreds of organizations. Hello, Troy. So let's get things started. Since this is the first webinar in our maturity model series, I would like to spend just a moment setting the stage for what a maturity model is and how it can be applied. First, a maturity model is a tool used to determine the effectiveness of current capabilities in a particular area of focus, and can help provide a decision path and prioritization for increasing that capability through maturity. Applying a maturity model to IAM is looking at various tenants within the IAM space, evaluating the current level for each tenant, and determining steps to increase capability to move to the next level. In this webinar series, we're going to focus on each of the core tenant areas of identity and access management and exploring the various levels of maturity and capability in each tenant. Our thought behind this webinar series is to provide a framework that can be covered in smaller, digestible segments that can be used as a tool to help organizations evaluate where they're at in their overall IAM strategy, as well as what areas to focus on in order to increase their level of maturity. It is important to mention that organizations may have products or solutions for various tenets of IAM in place already and maybe at various levels of maturity. Also important to note, there's not a rule that says that an organization has to implement each of the tenets in any particular order. That being said, let's jump into the first segment. In this first part of our series, we will focus on the maturity levels of Federation. We chose this as our first topic because Federation is less complex than some of the other tenets of IAM and can bring some quick IAM success to an organization. Again, it's important to note that your organization may have addressed one or more of these tenets already, and there's nothing that says that they have to be implemented in this particular order. However, we feel that if what you see here is a logical sequence for addressing a complete IAM solution, and that as an organization moves from the left to the right, the complexity for the strategy of tenants increases, but so does the capability and maturity of the solution as well. Troy is going to take us through the maturity of Federation, starting with the basic level and moving all the way through the mesh level. So with that, Troy, I'll turn it over to you.
So before I start talking about the Federation maturity model, I want to take a brief second to talk about what I hope everyone gets out of not just this one, but the rest of the series here. What I really want to provide you with are 3 things. One is I want to make sure that you have a method to measure your current and desired state for where you want to be with your identity management implementation and strategy. Secondly, being able to give you tangible steps with your move forward plan, because if your organization's anything like ours, sometimes it's tough to procure budget without having real tangible things to demonstrate the benefits. And then thirdly, help you in the midst of implementing your strategy, help you have a method in which you can measure the different identity management vendors that you're looking at to implement these capabilities that we're going to talk about. So those are the three things I really want to make sure that you get out of all of these webinars that we have. So now with Federation. So this being our first maturity model presentation, just know that when we talk about these different models, they're all going to have 4 levels. Level 1 would be basic in all cases. Level 4 is really kind of, you would have to be bleeding edge in order to be able to get all the way to level 4, which is fine. The point of it is, as you implement more capabilities that are talked about in these models, you're going to ever increase business value. And those business values come from a lot of different traits. It might be increased security, usability, reduction of costs, etc. What's also true of these maturity models is that there is a level 0. And level 0, in the case of the Federation maturity model, just means you're not doing Federation at all at this point, which of course is fine. And that's what we're going to talk about, the progression to get to where you need to be. So having said that, just kind of go through these in an overview. So level 1 is basic, where you'll have an identity provider in place and at least one service provider. Before I go on, let's talk about that terminology real quick to make sure we're all on the same page. So a service provider would be an application that your end user is accessing, maybe Salesforce or ServiceNow or Google Apps. Without Federation, those applications are going to do a native authentication and native authorization. And that's what your users would see. They would see, the Salesforce login, for example. But if they have service provider capabilities, they're going to be able to form a trust with an identity provider and offload that authentication and possibly 100% of the authorization to that identity provider. And in most cases, your organization would have the identity provider, and it would be pointed more than likely at your Active Directory. It could be any type of identity store. And so the experience of the user is they would go to an application, let's say Salesforce, and be redirected to their IDP to log in. So I can log in with credentials that I'm very familiar with, and then I would be redirected into Salesforce and seamlessly in that application as me. And then the real benefit is when I go to the second application, let's say ServiceNow, and it has service provider capability. And from my perspective, I just went right into ServiceNow, absolutely seamlessly and frictionless, no logins whatsoever. So that's service provider and identity provider. So back to the model at level 2, we call it integrated. And this basically is talking about the fact that there's multiple Federation protocols out there. So how are you going to be able to integrate with all of those? And then level 3, let's bump up our security by implementing multiple different types of authentication methods and implementing different types of authentication policies that are very granular and adaptive, as well as implementing just-in-time provisioning. And then last but not least, level 4, the ultimate, the mesh. This is where you'll have a lot of identity providers, maybe even internally, but certainly externally as third parties. And managing those and the sessions, it's not a simple task to achieve. And then kind of the ultimate end is where you can access service providers without having to have static identities being there at all through the use of what I consider virtual users. So that's the overview, and so we're going to dive into the details of those right now.
And I have a real quick question, Troy, before we go on. That was a great introduction. Is there any reason that an organization has to start with level 1 at basic, or can they go straight to level 4?
So in the case of Federation, you would, because the prerequisite to all of the levels is that you have an identity provider in place. So in this case, you would need to start there, but that doesn't mean you have to do level 1 to level 4 serially. You can certainly do capabilities in advance. So this is just one way of planning it out. So good question.
Okay, thanks, Troy. And we'll move you to the next slide here.
So this is just kind of going to get more into the details here. So the reason why we start with basic or the level 1 is because this is really low-hanging fruit as far as complexity of implementation, yet it has enormous immediate benefits to both your organization as well as your end users. So you'll have security improvements, a lower overhead and administrative tasks, having to manage all the different credentials across all the different systems, and your end users will have the benefit of great usability. They only have to know one credential, and they don't have to keep providing their login over and over again. So at level 1, you've deployed your identity provider with support for the SAML Federation protocol, and we're integrating with at least one, if not multiple of our SaaS applications. And like I said before, it could be things like Salesforce, ServiceNow, G Suite, Office 365, etc. Customers, we see all kinds of different deployments. We see customers deploying on-prem IDPs, cloud-based IDPs, and there's a variety of products out there. The other key piece to becoming level 1 is more of a strategic thing. So as an organization, you are not going to maximize the business value of implementing your federation, your identity provider, if you don't make it a strategic decision to, as much as you can, mandate that any new applications coming in the door fit the service provider model or support the service provider capabilities. Because again, the more you implement these capabilities, the higher the business value. Kind of not a side note, but down below the next step. So what do you kind of have to focus on to get to the next step? You really need to take inventory of your SaaS environment. Not only is it a business value thing to integrate them more to increase the usability for your end users, but it also deals with all the backdoor access of unmanaged accounts that you have in SaaS products that you're going to be dealing with by integrating, because you can no longer log in directly to the application. You have to go through the IDP.
So Troy, is Federation limited to only SaaS-based applications? What about if our customers or our attendees have custom written or internally developed applications?
Yeah, so it's becoming extremely common now for SaaS vendors to implement service provider capability because they want to make it easy for you to take advantage of using their products and services. We are seeing more and more customers that are doing internal development where their developers are learning that they can reduce costs and complexity by actually implementing service provider capabilities themselves. There's also a lot of services being offered to make federating or implementing federation for your application even easier. One thing that comes to mind is Amazon AWS has a service called Cognito. So your application developers can write to Cognito, and Cognito handles all of the complexity of being the service provider able to point to any identity provider you like, be it yours or even social media, such as Facebook logins and such.
Perfect, thanks.
Yeah, so we'll jump to level 2, which is quite a leap in the maturity model. The main thing that this is talking to is supporting multiple protocols. So in the world of federation, you have multiple protocols to deal with, all driven by what service providers are capable of. Starting at the top there. So assertion is what you call the data that the identity provider gives to the service provider, primarily to identify you so that they can enable a session within that system. So Like if I log into Salesforce, maybe the IDP is going to pass my email address because it can match me on email address inside of Salesforce. We want to take more advantage of these. So, for example, if the service providers support it, we want to be able to provide additional attributes about the user in the assertion, or maybe sending in static values. Every time someone logs into Salesforce, I'm talking from the administrator or the organization, I want it to always pass in certain static values, or even generating on-demand derived values to pass into the different service providers. A lot of capabilities can be enabled by doing this. The second thing is IDP chaining. So IDP chaining is unique to organizations that have multiple IDPs deployed. The best example, or the easiest example I can describe, is if you think about a state government, or even federal government for that matter. But in a state government, you've got different state departments, and most of the time they operate, in their own silos. But as a state employee, I want to log in with my State Department IDP and be able to access the resources provided by the other state departments without having to log into their IDP. So that's what chaining is. So each state department could chain with the other IDPs, State Department IDPs, and that way each employee only has to ever authenticate to their IDP where they know their credentials. And then to the big one, supporting multiple protocols. SAML has been around the longest. OAuth has been around quite some time. The point here is that service providers, the applications, what they're implementing is what's going to drive your requirements for what your IDP needs to support. So to only support one, I can tell you, is not going to be sufficient. So making sure that you can support multiple, you don't have to support all of them. It depends on your scenario, but you need to look at your service providers to kind of get a good idea as to what you need to support for your organization. And then next steps would be look at your MFA strategy as a whole and see what all capabilities there can you bring to the Federation strategy, because if you're doing MFA at a desktop, that doesn't necessarily apply when everything's happening through a web browser, because you might be on-prem, you might be at Starbucks, etc. So that will be the next level. Were there any questions on level 2, Greg, coming in?
Yeah, just one here in regards to, you mentioned a couple of the Federation protocols there. Is there one that's any better than the other?
Better? No. It's just, again, you have to look at the service providers that you're utilizing. SAML is the most commonly used. OAuth is primarily if you're going to want to support social IDPs like Facebook and Twitter and such. And OIDC is making a huge charge forward as far as its popularity. WS Federation is for very Microsoft centric organizations. And then you've got industry specific ones like CAS, which really are pretty much only used by higher ed. So it's what makes sense for your organization, of course.
Great, thank you.
Yep. So level 3 is primarily about implementing MFA. So, we all think of logging into a website using a username and password, and then maybe a one-time password token that we can plug in. But what's important is being able to support multiple types of authentication methods, all of which should increase security. But what about increasing usability? So if I do a mobile push authentication and the user just picks up their phone or their smart watch and say approve and they get logged in, not only is that an improvement of security to using passwords, but it's also a great boost in usability. And then being able to have multiple authentication policies. So, adaptive policies come to mind. If I'm sitting in the office, inside the corporate firewall, maybe I only need to log in with my password, for example. But if I do go out, whether I'm at home or at Starbucks, because I'm no longer inside the boundary of the organization, maybe I need to use stronger login like a FIDO token, one-time password, etc. Additionally is the cross-federation IDP. So in level 2, we started implementing or supporting multiple protocols, but level 3 takes that to the next level where for the end user, everything is one login. I don't care if I'm establishing a session that's an open ID Connect session or it's a CAS session, where however I start my session, I'm going to only log in once, and then the IDP is going to manage the different sessions with the different protocols on the back end. And then thirdly, we talked in level 1 and level 2 that they're going to provide great ROI. If we can get to just-in-time provisioning, which we talk about here in level 3, it's going to take that to a whole nother level. So just-in-time provisioning means as I log in to, say, Salesforce, it's going to take the attributes from the assertion, look for me, not find me, but instead of saying, sorry, we don't see you, it'll actually create me and create me in a way that it would have all the attributes populated in Salesforce that it needs in order to set me up with the exact access within Salesforce that I should have. So that's the just-in-time provisioning. So next steps to get to level 4, it's really that mesh. As an organization, if you're doing business with other businesses, with consumers, this is where the complexities of mesh, if you want to simplify administration, is going to come into play. Any questions before I move on there, Greg?
Yep, we're good. You can continue.
All right, so let's talk about level 4, mesh. So session management is becoming a bigger and bigger deal. What I mean by that, as a user, I'm going to log in once and I'm going to access all my applications. I don't care what the protocols and all this other crazy stuff is. When I log off, I'm going to assume that all of my sessions are closed so that if someone else comes up right after me to use that same machine, they're not going to hijack my sessions. And then as a administrator, an organization administrator, I want to, when bad things happen, I want to be able to go in and find a user and kill all of their sessions. This is not typically doable today in Federation. So this is a big deal going forward as we evolve our Federation maturity model. The second thing is, earlier we talked about IDP chaining. Chaining is typically something that's done internally where you've got a lot of IDPs, but it's all inside a bigger organization. Whereas IDP proxying is when you are providing services and you have an IDP, but based on who is accessing or who is coming to log in to your IDP and establish a session, you can have policies that redirect them to whatever their IDP is. Be it a completely different organization and product in the cloud somewhere, or a social media, a social login identity provider such as Facebook. So, think about it, you have vendors, partners, you're giving them access to resources internally, but you don't want to manage their passwords and such. So that's where the proxying comes in. And so thirdly, this is kind of the mecca, if you will, virtual users. So every time I've mentioned multiple identity providers in these different capabilities, the prerequisite for that to happen is that you have accounts in both sides. Even the just-in-time provisioning, it didn't have to be there at first, but it creates me so that I do exist. And the only way to have accounts sitting in both sides is if you're doing lifecycle management, which is a future maturity model that we'll discuss. With virtual users, the idea is I don't have to physically exist in the service provider's application. It's going to accept me as a user using the assertions and basically have a unique session defined for me with all the permissions and everything that I need. But when that session closes, I do not physically exist in that application anymore. So that's a virtual user concept. And it has been implemented today, at least in one scenario where if you're accessing AWS using SAML, it does not require that you have an AWS IAM user account exist. It's going to create a virtual user for you during your session, and logging and all of that. You would see, you would know that, for example, Troy logged in through all the logging and events and such. But as soon as I close my session, that user does not continue to exist. So obviously what I've gained there is I'm not having to manage yet another identity repository with users in it. This is just a concept, if you will. So we talked about one of the things I want to make sure you guys can walk away from with this session is, with the series, not just this session, is the ability to create your own scorecards. So whether you're scoring your current state, your future state, or using this to compare capabilities of different vendors, conceptually, this is what that's going to look like. So hopefully that gives you more of a visual as to what we're talking about there.
That's it. Thank you all so much, Greg and Troy. Unfortunately, that's all the time we do have for today. But as a reminder, we will be sending out a recording of today's webinar, as well as all of the questions asked today with their answers. And if you ask any case-specific questions, we'll be answering directly to you. Again, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to log on today and join us. And thank you to those who will be downloading and listening in after the fact. We look forward to continuing this series on June 19th with part 2, covering the multi-factor authentication maturity model. If you've already signed up, we will be sending out your registration reminder information. And for those of you who haven't signed up, be sure to keep your eyes peeled for an email with the details. Thanks again, and we hope everybody has a great day.